In the 1990s, a conservation team was clearing ground inside a former camp north of Berlin when the surface under the vegetation turned out to be 9 different surfaces laid in sequence. What that arrangement had been built for would overturn everything historians believed about how ordinary the machinery of that system became. The ground is a track. It runs in a rough oval, a few hundred yards long, and it is paved in segments: concrete, then cinder, then gravel, then sand, then cobbles, then a stretch of loose stone, and so on around the circuit. Each segment is a different material, and each is a controlled length. It is not a road. Roads do not change surface every 40 yards and then repeat. What it is a test facility. German footwear manufacturers needed to know how sole materials performed under sustained wear across varied ground, and the standard way to obtain that data is to have somebody walk on it. So prisoners were assigned to walk the circuit, in boots supplied for testing, for a working day. The recorded distance is around 25 miles a day. The boots were frequently the wrong size, sometimes deliberately, and men were made to carry weighted packs to increase the load. And most disturbing of all, this was a punishment detail. The camp system is normally described in terms of its extremes: the killing centers, the medical experiments, the numbers. Those are the parts that appear in every account, and they should. What sits less comfortably in the story is the middle of the apparatus, the part that was not exceptional at all. And this is what that part looks like: a commercial testing requirement, a technical specification, a supply of people, and a facility built to bring them together. Somebody designed this track. Somebody chose the 9 surfaces and the length of each. Somebody at a manufacturer specified what data they needed, and somebody else worked out how to obtain it, and the arrangement ran for years. There is correspondence. This was not concealed within the camp administration because there was nothing about it that anybody involved appears to have regarded as requiring concealment. It was procurement. The prisoners assigned to it were sent for infractions, and the assignment was known within the camp as one of the worst available, because a man walking that distance daily in unsuitable footwear does not last, and the alternative readings close one by one. Not a punishment invented on site, because the specification came from outside. Not an improvisation, because the 9 surfaces are laid deliberately and repeat. Not a marginal arrangement, because it ran for years and consumed a standing allocation of men. Every element of it required somebody outside the camp to ask for something. The honest qualifications are these: figures for how many men passed through the detail are estimates drawn from camp records that are incomplete, and mortality specific to it cannot be separated from the general mortality of the camp. The extent to which individual firms knew the conditions under which their testing was carried out is documented for some and inferred for others, and the track was in use for a limited period within a camp that operated for over a decade. What is not in dispute is what the surfaces are, or what they were for. The truly disturbing part is not the cruelty, it is the paperwork. Everything on this list involves people doing something monstrous, and almost all of it required a decision somebody had to make and could have refused. This required a purchase order. Somebody in an office needed wear data, and the route from that need to a man walking 25 miles a day ran through entirely ordinary commercial channels, none of which had to be corrupted to carry it. How much of the apparatus was like this? Records naming which firms received the resulting data survive only in fragments, and the men who walked the circuit were not recorded individually at all. Most of the track survives, overgrown at the edges, with the 9 surfaces still distinguishable where they meet. The camp is a memorial, and the track is part of the site. The firms that commissioned the testing continued trading after the war, and the shoes they were developing went on sale. Number 2. Waldrich Tunnel. In 2015, 2 treasure hunters in southwestern Poland took a ground-penetrating radar survey to a regional official and showed him a shape under a hillside that appeared to be 100 meters long. What the world would conclude about that shape would overturn nothing at all, and that is the point of it. The claim was a train, specifically an armored German train, loaded and sealed, run into a tunnel in the closing months of the war and hidden there, and the radar image was said to show carriages, a locomotive, and the outline of gun turrets. The 2 men announced it through a lawyer, requesting a percentage of the value under Polish fines law before disclosing the location. Within days, It was on the front page of newspapers on 4 continents. The regional deputy culture minister told a press conference he had seen the image and was 99% certain the train existed. The town filled with treasure hunters. Hotels sold out. Property prices in the area rose. And most disturbing of all, the army was sent in to check for explosives. There was a reason the story was plausible, and it was not gullibility. The region is riddled with genuine wartime tunneling, some of it unmapped. Trains were used to move looted property. Objects taken from occupied Europe are still missing in quantities that are difficult to state, including a substantial fraction of the art removed from Poland, and recoveries do still happen. Nobody covering the story had to believe in anything supernatural. They had to believe in a documented practice, in a region where the practice occurred, in a country whose cultural property was systematically removed and never fully returned. In 2016, a team from a mining academy took proper equipment to the site: magnetic survey, gravimetric measurement, and their own radar, run as a controlled study rather than as a demonstration. There was no train, there was no tunnel at that location. The anomaly in the original image is consistent with a natural feature of the ground, and the excavation carried out later that year confirmed it: soil, rock, and nothing else. And the checks that should have caught it were skipped in a specific order. The image was never independently reviewed before the announcement. The claim was made through a lawyer negotiating a finder's percentage, which is a commercial interest, and was reported as a detail rather than as a reason for caution. A regional official, with no relevant expertise, put a probability figure on it at a press conference. And the story traveled the world before any instrument touched the ground. The qualifications are worth stating fairly. The 2 men who made the claim have maintained it and have argued that the search was conducted in the wrong place. Regional tunneling is real, and some of it genuinely remains unsurveyed. And the wider question the story attached itself to is not a fantasy. Enormous quantities of property were taken and never recovered, and the absence of it is a live legal and diplomatic issue. What is not in dispute is that the survey found nothing. The truly disturbing part is not the hoax, if it was one. It is what the episode did to the actual work. Archaeologists working on wartime sites in that region spend a substantial part of their professional lives on projects that produce careful, unglamorous, evidentially solid results about camps, graves, and forced labor, and the story that reached 4 continents was the one with a gold train in it. Which of those does a member of the public now associate with the archaeology of that period? The truly disturbing part is not the failure of the search. It is that the region genuinely does hold unmapped wartime tunneling. Unrecovered property genuinely was taken in quantity, and the one claim that reached the world was the one that turned out to be nothing. What happens to a real question after a story like this attaches itself to it? The tunnel network is real and partly uncharted. The excavation at the site produced nothing and was closed. The 2 men are still looking, and the town has kept the signage. Number 3. Project Riese. In the 1940s, surveyors were working through a mountain range in Lower Silesia when they came out with a plan for something the Reich could not have completed and could not explain. What the excavation of it would eventually reveal would overturn everything historians believed about what a collapsing state will spend its labor on. What is under those mountains is around 6 miles of tunnel across 7 separate complexes, cut into hard rock, at depths of up to 50 meters. Some sections are finished and lined with reinforced concrete. Some are raw rock with the drill marks still in the face. There are ventilation shafts, drainage channels, and chambers of a size that indicates machinery was intended. There are also sections that simply stop, mid-cut, where the work ended. Nothing was ever installed in any of it. The construction ran from 1943 and consumed resources at a rate that is difficult to make sense of. Contemporary figures indicate the project used more concrete in a year than was allocated for air raid shelters for the entire German civilian population. This is a state under sustained bombing, with cities burning, diverting structural material away from protecting its own people, into a hole in a mountain with no defined function. And most disturbing of all, nobody has ever established what it was for. The explanations offered are the obvious ones, and none of them fits cleanly. A relocated headquarters is the most common, and the layout of some complexes is consistent with it. though the scale exceeds what any command function would require. Underground armaments production is proposed, and dispersal of manufacturing into tunnels was genuine German policy by that stage of the war. But the chamber dimensions and the absence of rail access at several complexes argue against it. A weapons program has been suggested repeatedly, and there is no documentary support for it whatsoever. The planning records were destroyed. What is documented is who dug it. The labor came from a concentration camp established specifically to supply the project, and the workforce was drawn largely from prisoners deported for that purpose. Conditions in the tunnels were what conditions in unventilated rock excavation with hand tools and no safety provision are, and the death toll among the workforce is estimated in the thousands. The camp was liquidated as the front approached, but here is where it stops being an engineering mystery. The absence of a purpose is not a gap in the record. It may be the finding. A project of this size, in that year, with the war visibly lost, does not require a rational objective to explain it, because the decision-making apparatus by that point was not producing rational objectives. What the tunnels may document is a state continuing to consume lives and material on a program nobody could justify, because stopping would have required somebody to say so, and the readings that would make it rational fail on the detail. Not a headquarters, because the volume exceeds anything a command function needs, and several complexes have no road access adequate to supply one. Not dispersed manufacturing, because the chamber dimensions do not match the machinery of the period, and rail connection was never built. Not storage, because nothing was ever stored. Every functional explanation requires something that was never installed. The qualifications belong here. Estimates of total tunnel length vary, and some complexes remain incompletely surveyed. Death toll figures for the labor force are reconstructions from camp records that are partial. And absence of documentation is not proof that no purpose existed. The planning material was destroyed, and what was destroyed is by definition unavailable. What is not in dispute is the volume of rock removed. The truly disturbing part is not the mystery, it is the arithmetic underneath it. Concrete that was not poured into shelters was poured into this, in a year of sustained bombing, which means a calculation was made about whose protection mattered, and the answer is legible in the volume of rock removed. What does a state look like at the point where that trade stops being noticed? Several complexes are open to visitors and several are not, and sections remain flooded or unstable. The rock faces still carry the marks of the last shift. Nothing was ever put in there, and nobody has ever found a document saying what was supposed to go in. Number 4. Lager silt. In 2010, an archaeological team was walking a field on a small island in the English Channel, mapping features under the turf, when the outlines that came up matched a plan nobody expected to find on British soil. What that layout was would overturn everything the public believed about where this system reached. The island is Alderney, the northernmost of the Channel Islands, and it was occupied from 1940 until the end of the war. Its civilian population had been evacuated before the occupation, which left the island empty and available. 4 labor camps were built on it. 3 were administered by the organization Todt, the construction agency, and used forced and slave labor to build fortifications. The 4th was different. From March 1943, it was transferred to SS administration as a sub-camp of a concentration camp on the mainland, which makes it the only SS concentration camp ever established on British territory. What the survey found is the plan of it: foundations of the huts, the gate posts, the commandant's house, and a tunnel running from it into the camp. The perimeter. The site had been partly demolished and had been under agricultural land and vegetation for decades, and the mapping recovered the layout without excavation, using geophysics and aerial survey. And most disturbing of all, the death toll has never been settled. For decades, the accepted figure came from a British intelligence report compiled immediately after the war, which put the total deaths across all the island's camps at something under 400. That figure entered the literature and stayed there. It sat alongside a general understanding that the Channel Islands occupation was comparatively mild, a matter of rationing and collaboration and awkward post-war questions, rather than of atrocity, and that whatever had happened on Alderney was at the smaller end of a very large scale. In 2024, A review commissioned by the British government and conducted by an international panel of historians concluded that the figure was too low. Their assessment put the likely range between 641 and 1,027 deaths. The revision came from re-examining the original records, from Soviet and other archives that had not been available to the original investigators, and from the recognition that the post-war count had been assembled quickly, under pressure, by people with limited access, and the reasons the original figure survived are identifiable. The post-war investigation was conducted in weeks by an officer with no forensic support. The Soviet material was inaccessible for 4 decades. The islands were returned to civil administration quickly, and there was no institutional owner of the question. And a low number, once printed, becomes the number that gets cited, because every subsequent account cites the last one. The qualifications are real, and the panel stated them. Even the revised range is a range, and the upper and lower figures differ by more than 50%. Records were destroyed, prisoners arrived and left without documentation, and burial locations are incompletely known. Claims of far higher totals have circulated for years, and the panel examined them and did not support them. What is not in dispute is that the camp existed, that it was SS administered, or that the original figure was wrong. The truly disturbing part is not the number, it is that this took until 2024. The site is in British territorial jurisdiction, a short flight from England, in a country with one of the most developed heritage sectors in the world. Nobody was preventing the work. It simply was not done, for 70 years, and the figure everybody used was one that had never been properly checked. How many other figures in the record are like that? The truly disturbing part is not the revision, it is that nobody was stopping the work. This is British jurisdiction, a short flight from England, with no political obstacle and no access problem, and the reason the figure stood for 70 years is that no institution regarded it as theirs to check. How many settled numbers are settled only because nobody has looked again? Records naming the prisoners held there were destroyed before the evacuation, and the post-war recovery of names has depended on cross-referencing archives in 4 countries. Much of the site is under farmland, and the surveyed features remain unexcavated. Some burial locations are established, and some are not. The gateposts still stand at the entrance, in a field, with nothing to indicate what they were the entrance to. Number 5. Sobibor. In 2014, an excavation team working in a forest in eastern Poland was digging beneath a paved road when they reached brickwork laid in a pattern that told them exactly what they had found. What was under that road would overturn everything anybody assumed about how completely a place can be erased. The site is Sobibor, and it was one of 3 camps built under a program whose function was killing rather than labor. It operated for roughly 18 months from 1942. In October 1943, the prisoners staged an uprising, several hundred escaped, and the response was to close the camp entirely. Not abandon it. The buildings were dismantled, the ground was leveled, trees were planted across the whole site, and a farm was established on it with an occupant installed. The intention was that there would be nothing to find. For decades, there was very little. The site was known and commemorated, but the physical layout was uncertain, and the location of the killing installations in particular was disputed, because the demolition had been thorough and the plantation had matured over the ground. What the excavation established, working under a road laid across the site in the post-war period, was the foundations of the gas chambers themselves, brick footings, a corridor, the internal divisions. The dimensions matched survivor testimony, and most disturbing of all, the road had been built directly over them, without anybody knowing. The question that hangs over sites like this is not really archaeological. Everything material about what happened at these camps is attested by survivors, by perpetrator testimony at post-war trials, by German documentation, and by the absence of hundreds of thousands of people. The evidentiary basis has never depended on excavation. What excavation adds is something else. It converts testimony into a floor plan, a measurement, a physical object that can be stood next to, and it does that specifically because there are people who require it. There are 5 more of these, and the last one ends with a place that was demolished, plowed, and planted so that nothing would remain, and what the survey found there anyway. Subscribe now and stay for it. The work also matters for a reason, internal to the discipline. Sites of this kind were long regarded as belonging to history rather than to archaeology, on the reasoning that a period with abundant documentation does not need excavating. This is the site that changed that view, and the field it opened now works across the whole of the 20th century. What the work at this site also recovered were personal objects, in quantity, from the path leading to the chambers. Among them, in 2016, was a small pendant, triangular, inscribed with a date of birth in 1929, a place name, and a Hebrew inscription. Research identified the owner, a girl from Frankfurt, deported at 14. The pendant is nearly identical to one belonging to Anne Frank, who was born within weeks of her, and the two are the only known examples of the type. The truly disturbing part is not the road, it is what the demolition assumed. Somebody calculated what would survive, dismantled to that calculation, and planted over the result, which means the erasure was designed by people who expected the site to be searched and believed they could defeat the search. They were right for 70 years. How many other things were taken apart by somebody who did the same arithmetic and got it right permanently? The qualifications are appropriate. Excavation at killing sites is constrained by religious law regarding the disturbance of human remains, and the work was conducted under rabbinical supervision with those constraints observed, which limits what can be investigated. The area excavated is a fraction of the site, and identification of individual objects depends on documentary work that succeeds rarely. What is not in dispute is the foundations. Excavation covers a small fraction of the ground, and the constraints that limit it are permanent rather than practical. Around 250,000 people were killed at that site, and the number of individuals who can be named is a fraction of 1%. Most of the site remains unexcavated and will remain so. The road was removed. A memorial now stands over the foundations, and the personal objects recovered from the path are in a museum on the site, catalogued, most of them belonging to nobody anyone has been able to name. Number 6. Toyama remains. In 1989, a construction crew preparing ground for a building in central Tokyo cut into a layer of earth and stopped, because what was in it was human, and there was a great deal of it. What the investigation would and would not establish about those remains would overturn everything anybody assumed about how a state accounts for its own records. The site is in Shinjuku, in one of the densest urban districts in the world, and the ground being cleared had been occupied by the Army Medical College. The remains recovered numbered around 100 individuals. They were not a burial. Analysis found drill holes in skulls, cut marks, sections removed, and evidence consistent with anatomical or pathological preparation. Some showed signs of having been dissected. The population was mixed and included individuals whose skeletal characteristics indicated origins outside Japan. The building being constructed was for a public health institute. The medical college that had stood on the site had a specific institutional relationship. It was the parent body of a military unit stationed in occupied Manchuria that conducted biological warfare research on human subjects, and personnel moved between them. That unit's activities are documented, and the post-war arrangement under which senior figures avoided prosecution in exchange for their research data is also documented. Nothing about that background is disputed by historians. And most disturbing of all, the official investigation could not establish where the remains came from. The account most people outside Japan carry of that country's war record is that it has been less thoroughly examined than Germany's, and that the difference is one of national will. It is a comparison that gets made frequently, and it is not entirely wrong, but it flattens something. The investigations that followed this discovery were conducted, findings were published, and the government funded work on it. What did not happen is identification. The report, published in 1992, established what the remains were and what had been done to them, and could not determine their origin because the records that would have answered it were destroyed at the end of the war. Deliberately, comprehensively, on instruction. But here is where it stops being about one site. The destruction was not incidental to defeat. Orders were issued to burn documentation across the relevant institutions, and personnel were instructed on what to say. The remains in that ground are the physical residue of a program whose paper trail was eliminated by the people who ran it, which means the bones are now the primary source, and bones cannot say who they belong to. The truly disturbing part is not the destruction of the records, it is that it worked. Burning documents is the crudest possible countermeasure, and it defeated everything that came afterward: an official investigation with government funding, forensic analysis, and 30 years of subsequent inquiry. 100 people are in that ground, and the reason nobody can be named is a decision somebody made in a week in 1945. What else was closed off that cheaply? The qualifications belong here. The connection between these particular remains and that particular unit is inferred from the site's institutional history and has never been demonstrated. Alternative explanations exist, including ordinary anatomical teaching collections, which were assembled in ways that would themselves raise questions. Later excavation, prompted by testimony from a former nurse, recovered further remains at a nearby location. What is not in dispute is the condition of the bones. The truly disturbing part is not the remains, it is what the bones now have to do. Documentation exists so that people can be accounted for by name, and where it has been destroyed, the physical remains become the only record, and physical remains cannot answer the one question that matters to a family. What is left when the paperwork was the memory? The investigation that followed cost money and produced a published report, and it ended where the paper trail ended. No comparable excavation has been conducted at the other institutional sites connected to the same program, and several of those buildings are still in use. The remains are held in a facility maintained for the purpose, awaiting identification that is not going to occur. The building was completed. The families of anybody in that ground do not know, and there is no mechanism by which they could be told. Number 7. Bikini Atoll. In 1989, a diving survey team descended onto the lagoon floor of a Pacific atoll and found an aircraft carrier sitting upright on the sand with its flight deck intact. What the fleet around it was doing there would overturn everything anybody assumed about what happened after the war ended. The ships were sunk deliberately. In 1946, less than a year after the surrender, the United States assembled a fleet of over 90 vessels in the lagoon as targets for the first post-war nuclear tests. The fleet included captured Japanese and German warships, American vessels of every class, and submarines. 2 weapons were detonated, one in the air and one underwater, and the survey team was diving what remained. The carrier is one of several major wrecks lying within a few hundred yards of each other, and the Japanese flagship from the attack on Pearl Harbor is among them, upside down. The atoll was inhabited. In 1946, the residents, a community of 167 people, were asked by the military governor to leave temporarily so that the testing could proceed, in a request framed as being for the good of mankind and the ending of all wars. They agreed and were moved to another atoll. That island could not support them. They were moved again and again, and there was a period of serious hunger. And most disturbing of all, 23 weapons were tested there over the following 12 years. The way this period is usually told separates the war from what came after. The war ends in 1945, the post-war order is constructed, and the nuclear tests belong to a different story about the Cold War, the arms race, and deterrence. They are dated to the 50s and 60s and associated with silos and treaties rather than with the conflict that preceded them. What the lagoon floor shows is that the first of them happened before the war's paperwork was finished, using that war's ships, in a place emptied for the purpose. Some of those residents were returned in the 1970s after the atoll was declared safe. Subsequent testing found cesium in the food chain, in the coconut crabs, and in the plants, and body burdens in the returned population rising to levels that required their removal again. They were evacuated a second time. The islands remain formally uninhabited by their own people, and the compensation arrangements have been litigated for decades. And the alternatives that would have avoided this were available and rejected. Uninhabited atolls existed within the same testing range. The program could have been conducted at sites already under military control with no resident population. The relocation was described as temporary in the request and was never given a term. Each of those was a decision, made by somebody, in advance. The qualifications are worth stating. Radiological conditions vary enormously across the atoll, and some areas are close to background while others are not, which is why assessments of habitability have differed and changed. The decisions of 1946 were made with a scientific understanding of fallout that was genuinely incomplete, and the community has been consulted extensively in later decades, though not in the ones that mattered. What is not in dispute is that they have not been able to return. The truly disturbing part is not the wrecks, it is the sequence. A community was moved for a temporary program, the program continued for 12 years, and the temporary condition has now lasted 80. Descendants of the original residents are 3 generations deep in a diaspora, and many have never seen the place. What is the word for a displacement that outlives everybody who agreed to it? The truly disturbing part is not the contamination, it is the shape of the promise. A community agreed to leave on a request framed as temporary and framed as being for the good of everybody, and neither the temporariness nor the good was ever defined or reviewed. What is an agreement worth when only one side can decide when it ends? Radiological survey of the atoll has been repeated across 7 decades, and the results still differ between agencies, which is why the question of habitability has never closed. The wrecks are surveyed and are a diving site. The lagoon is one of the best preserved 20th century naval assemblages anywhere, precisely because nobody lives near enough to salvage it. The atoll is on the World Heritage List. Number 8. Strasbourg Collection. In 2015, a physician researching the history of a French medical school opened a storeroom in the Forensic Institute and found jars that had been sitting there since the war. What was in them would overturn everything anybody assumed had been resolved 70 years earlier. The institution is the University at Strasbourg, which during the occupation was reconstituted as a German university. Its anatomy department was directed by a professor who proposed, in 1942, that a collection of skeletons be assembled for comparative anatomical study, on the reasoning that the population he wished to study would shortly cease to exist and that specimens should be secured before that happened. The proposal was approved by the SS. 86 people were selected at Auschwitz on the basis of physical measurements, transported to a camp in Alsace, and killed there. The bodies were delivered to the anatomy department. The department was in the process of preparing them when the front approached in 1944, and the work was left incomplete. When French forces reached the university, remains were found in the building. That much was known immediately and was raised at the post-war trials. What was not known was that the disposal was partial. The remains recovered in 1944 were buried, and the case was regarded as closed. And most disturbing of all, some of the material never left the building. What made the 2015 discovery possible was a piece of work done a decade earlier by a German historian who set out to establish the identities of the 86. They had been recorded only by tattooed numbers. Working from camp lists, transport records, and correspondence, he matched every number to a name and published them. 86 people, who had been reduced to a measurement series in an academic proposal, were returned to being individuals with families, birthplaces, and dates, and the work took years. The storeroom contained tissue samples and remains held in preservative, catalogued and shelved in an institution that had been operating continuously as a teaching and forensic facility for 70 years. Nobody had known. The material was identified as belonging to the same group, removed, and buried with the others. But here is where it stops being an oversight. An anatomical collection is an institutional asset. It is catalogued, stored, maintained, and passed between departments, and its provenance is recorded because provenance is what makes a specimen scientifically usable. The material sat in a functioning department through the entire post-war period, and the thing that eventually surfaced it was not an audit. It was a physician reading the history of his own institution out of curiosity, and the ordinary institutional explanations do not cover it. Not a lost cupboard, because the material was catalogued. Not wartime chaos, because it survived 70 years of peacetime administration. Not ignorance of its origin, because provenance is exactly what an anatomical collection records. The qualifications are appropriate. The quantity of material recovered in 2015 was small relative to what had been buried in 1944. Whether its retention was deliberate or the result of institutional inertia across generations of staff cannot be determined, and the university had itself conducted historical investigations previously without finding it. What is not in dispute is that it was there. The truly disturbing part is not the collection. It is the purpose it was assembled for. This was not an atrocity committed in a camp by men under orders. It was a research proposal, written by a professor, reviewed and approved through academic and administrative channels to obtain specimens that could not be obtained otherwise. Every step of it happened inside a university. What is a scientific institution that this route was available to somebody inside one? No audit of anatomical holdings of that period was ever conducted across European medical faculties, and no register exists of what any of them contain. The 86 are named on a memorial at the site of the camp where they were killed. The identification work exists because one historian spent years on it without being asked to. The university has published its own institutional history of the period, and the anatomy department is still in the same building. Number 9. Oradour-sur-Glane. In the 1990s, conservation architects, surveying a preserved village in central France, reported that the thing they were charged with protecting was failing structurally, and that protecting it further would mean altering it. What that dilemma exposes would overturn everything anybody assumed about what preservation is for. The village is Oradour-sur-Glane. On the 10th of June 1944, an SS armored division entering the area killed 643 people there, almost the entire population, and burned the village. After the war, the French government decided the ruins would not be rebuilt. A new village was constructed alongside, and the old one was left exactly as it was found, as a permanent memorial and as evidence. What that means physically is that the site is a village frozen at the moment of its destruction, and it includes the ordinary things a village contains. Burnt-out cars in the street, sewing machines in the ruins of houses, bed frames, a set of scales in the shell of a shop, bicycles, the tram lines running through it, domestic objects, in situ, rusting, in roofless rooms open to the weather for 80 years. And most disturbing of all, that is the problem. A ruin is not a stable object. Masonry that has been burned is weakened and continues to weaken. Frost gets into it. Vegetation roots into the joints. Iron oxidizes and expands and splits the stone it is set into. Every object in the village that was left where it lay has spent 80 years in the open, and the site as a whole is degrading at a rate that conservation surveys have documented and that has accelerated. Doing nothing is not a neutral option. It is a decision to allow the evidence to disappear, but the alternative is worse in a different way. Stabilizing a wall means introducing new material. Sheltering an object means changing what a visitor sees. Replacing a corroded fitting means the fitting is no longer the one that was there. The authenticity of the site is the whole of its value, and every intervention that preserves it reduces the thing being preserved. The conservation literature on this site is unusually anguished for a technical field, because the professionals involved understand exactly what they are trading. And there is no third option available. Enclosing the site under cover has been considered and rejected, because a roofed ruin is no longer a ruin and the sky is part of what a visitor sees. Removing objects to a museum preserves them and destroys the thing that makes them evidence, which is that they are where they were left. Full reconstruction was rejected at the outset and remains unthinkable. Every route out of the problem removes the reason for the problem. The qualifications belong here. Some intervention has always occurred. The site was never truly untouched, and paths, safety works, and drainage have been added since the 1940s. Decisions about which objects to protect and which to let go have been made and are not fully public, and the site's status as evidence has a specific history. It was preserved partly to serve a legal and political function in the post-war period, which shaped what was kept. What is not in dispute is the deterioration. The truly disturbing part is not the decay, it is what it implies about every preserved site of this kind. Physical evidence was retained precisely because testimony was expected to end, and the objects were supposed to be the thing that outlasted the witnesses. The last survivors of that day have now died. And the objects are going too, on a timescale that is measurable, which means the period during which both existed is over, and the period during which neither does has a date. There is no established conservation doctrine for a site whose value is its untouched state, because the discipline was built around objects that were always going to be intervened in. Structural survey has been repeated at intervals since the 1990s, and every report has recorded further loss, at a rate that can be projected forward, and has been. The village is open to visitors and free to enter. A memorial center stands at the entrance. The objects in the streets are photographed constantly, and the photographs will outlast them by a considerable margin. Number 10. Treblinka. In 2010, an archaeologist began a survey of a forest clearing in eastern Poland, where the accepted position was that nothing physical remained to survey. What she would find under a site that had been demolished, plowed, and planted would overturn everything anybody believed about whether erasure can be made to work. The site is Treblinka. Between July 1942 and October 1943, something in the region of 800,000 people were killed there. In November 1943, the camp was dismantled. Not damaged in fighting, and not abandoned. Taken apart. Structures were demolished and the materials removed. The ground was leveled and plowed. Lupins were sown across it. A farmhouse was built on the site, and a farmer was installed to live there and work the land, so that anybody arriving would find agricultural ground with somebody farming it. The operation was carried out to a plan, and the plan worked well enough that the physical layout of the camp remained genuinely uncertain for 60 years. What made the survey possible is that it did not require digging. Airborne laser scanning strips the vegetation from a landscape computationally and returns the shape of the ground beneath it, revealing depressions, embankments, and disturbances invisible from the surface. Ground-penetrating radar and resistivity map what is under it without breaking the surface. These methods matter here for a specific reason. Excavation at a site containing human remains is constrained by religious law, and the survey was conducted under rabbinical supervision with those constraints observed throughout. And most disturbing of all, the ground had kept everything. The scanning showed large disturbed areas consistent with mass graves, in positions that match survivor accounts. Limited excavation, permitted where remains were not present, exposed foundations of a building whose dimensions and internal divisions correspond to the descriptions of the gas chambers given in testimony and at trial. And among the material recovered were tiles from the floor of that structure. The tiles carry a maker's mark in the form of a six-pointed star. That mark was widely reported at the time as a deliberate obscenity, and it is not. It is the trademark of a Polish tile manufacturer that had used it for decades, and its presence indicates the source of the building materials rather than any intention. The correction matters, because a finding of this weight cannot afford an error attached to it. But here is where it stops being about one clearing. The demolition was not concealment of a crime in the ordinary sense. It was carried out with an understanding that the site would be looked for, by people who calculated what would remain, and it was thorough enough to succeed for 6 decades. What defeated it was not a document and not a witness. It was that ground remembers being disturbed, in ways that cannot be undone by plowing, and that instruments now exist which read that. The qualifications are stated plainly by the researcher who did the work. The excavated area is small, and the identification of the structure rests on dimensions and location rather than on an inscription. Estimates of the total killed vary between sources and derive from transport records rather than from anything at the site, and the survey was constrained, deliberately, in ways that leave most of the ground uninvestigated. What is not in dispute is the foundations or the graves. The truly disturbing part is not what was found, it is what the finding is for. Nobody working on this site needed convincing of what happened there, because it is among the best attested events in modern history. The work was done because the last people who could say so in the first person are gone, and because there are people who will say it did not happen. What does it mean that a discipline has had to become a witness? Most of the site remains unexcavated and will stay that way. The farmhouse is gone. The lupins the demolition team sowed still come up across the clearing every summer, which is the only part of the plan that is still working. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.